In 1943, the Italian mafia ruled New York with an iron fist. They owned the docks, the unions, the judges, half of City Hall. But there was one border on the map they would not cross after the sun went down. Not because a wall stood there, not because the police stopped them, because the men who tried it before didn't come back, and the men who sent them stopped asking why. Harlem wasn't just a neighborhood to the families downtown. For years, they'd treated it the way they treated everything else in the city, as territory to be assessed, priced, and eventually taken. But by the winter of 1943, something had changed in how the Commission talked about those streets above 110th. The word that started showing up in their conversations, the word that made grown men who ran murder for a living go quiet, was sovereign. Harlem was Bumpy Johnson's, and it stayed his, and everybody downtown who mattered had learned that the hard way. This is the story of how that happened. Not the version that made it into the newspapers, because almost none of it did. The version that got passed down on stoops and in barbershops. The version old men in Harlem still tell if you sit with them long enough and ask the right questions. It's the story of a man who didn't just defend a neighborhood. He turned it into a trap that swallowed the best killers Italy ever exported to this country. And he did it with patience, with information, and with a level of nerve that even his enemies eventually had to respect. To understand why Sicilian hitmen wouldn't set foot above 110th Street after dark, you first have to understand what New York looked like in early 1943. The country was at war, ships were leaving the harbor loaded with men who might not come back, and the city that sent them off was running on rationed gasoline, blacked-out windows, and a level of nervous tension that most people alive today never had to feel. Air raid wardens walked the blocks at night, making sure no light leaked out from behind curtains, because nobody knew for certain that a German plane wouldn't find its way across the Atlantic and use the glow of Manhattan to aim. It sounds almost quaint now, but at the time it was treated with total seriousness. Whole neighborhoods went dark on cue, streetlights dimmed, headlights got taped down to slits. For the criminal world, that darkness was a gift. Nobody understood that better than the mob. A blacked-out city is a city where a car can idle on a corner without anyone clocking the plate number, where two men can grab a third and be gone before a patrolman, 3 blocks over, even hears the scuffle. Wartime blackout conditions had, without anyone planning it that way, turned every commercial district in New York into better cover for violence than it had ever had in peacetime. Bumpy Johnson understood this before most people did, and he used it. While the mob was thinking about the blackout as an opportunity to move against him more easily, Johnson was thinking about it as an opportunity to distance his own operations even further from view, and to turn the geography of Harlem itself into a weapon. By 1943, Ellsworth Johnson was not the man he'd been 10 years earlier. In the 20s and into the 30s, he'd been what people in the life called an enforcer, somebody who collected, who leaned on people, who did the physical work that kept a numbers operation running smoothly. He'd done time, he'd taken beatings and given worse ones back, but somewhere in the years working under Stephanie St. Clair, watching how she built and protected her policy empire against everyone, from crooked cops to Dutch Schultz's crew, Johnson had absorbed something most street enforcers never learn. He'd learned to think in systems instead of just fights. By the time the war started, Johnson wasn't running Harlem the way a boxer runs a corner, throwing punches when someone wandered into his space. He was running it the way a general runs a theater of operations, with layers, with redundancy, with people positioned not because they were tough, but because they were useful, and with a level of intelligence gathering that most professional law enforcement outfits in the city couldn't match. Picture the structure the way people who lived through it describe it. At street level, you had the runners, the ordinary men and women collecting policy slips, moving cash, watching corners, invisible in plain sight because they looked like anybody heading to work or coming home from it. Above them, lieutenants who each controlled a slice of territory, small enough to manage personally, but connected enough to the whole that information moved fast in both directions. And above all of that, an inner circle Johnson trusted with the things that could get a man killed if they leaked. The locations of cash, the identities of paid police contacts, the schedule of any outside crew that might be moving through the neighborhood. That last part was the piece that made Harlem different, from every other territory the mob had ever tried to absorb. Johnson didn't just have soldiers, he had ears. Cops who took money from both sides but reported everything back to Johnson because he paid better, and because, frankly, they lived in the city too and understood which side actually had the neighborhood's loyalty. Bartenders who'd pour a drink for a stranger in an expensive suit and remember every word that stranger said to his friend after the second round. Cab drivers who'd pick up two men downtown, drive them uptown, and know exactly where they got dropped off and what they asked the driver about the neighborhood along the way. Doormen, elevator operators, girls who worked the clubs on 7th Avenue and had learned, the same as everybody else, that a little pillow talk passed along quietly was worth more than any tip. This is the part people miss when they picture organized crime as just men with guns. The real weapon Bumpy Johnson had wasn't the shotguns waiting in the storage room above a club. It was that by the time any outside crew crossed into his territory, he usually already knew they were coming, knew roughly why, and had time to decide exactly how he wanted the encounter to go. You cannot ambush a man who has 3 days' notice. You can only walk into whatever he's built for you. Now, think about what that meant for the men Frank Costello and the Commission were sending north. These weren't amateurs. The killers the families used for serious work in 1943 had done this before, in Brooklyn, in New Jersey, sometimes back in Sicily itself, before they ever crossed the ocean. They were professionals in the coldest sense of the word, calm under pressure, comfortable with violence, trained to move fast and disappear faster. In their own territory, in the neighborhoods they knew, they were close to unstoppable. Harlem wasn't their territory, and it never became their territory, no matter how many times they tried. Start with the geography itself. If you've never walked those blocks, it's hard to picture exactly what made them so different from the rest of Manhattan. But people who were there describe it in ways that stick with you. Harlem in the 1940s was dense in a way that favored the people who lived there. Brownstones packed close together, fire escapes running up the backs of buildings like ladders nobody official ever counted, rooftops that connected block to block if you knew which ledges to cross and which gaps were too wide to risk, alleys that dead-ended unless you knew the one gate that opened into the next block's courtyard. To an outsider, it looked like any other dense city neighborhood. To the people who'd grown up running those roofs as kids, it was a maze with 1,000 exits and only a handful of them marked. Johnson's people used that terrain the way soldiers use a mountain range. Spotters posted on rooftops could watch 3 or 4 streets at once and pass word down through a chain of whistles, knocks on window frames, kids sent running with a message disguised as an errand. A car that didn't belong got noticed within minutes of parking. 2 men in suits too clean for the neighborhood, walking with the particular stiffness of men carrying something under their jackets, got noticed before they'd gone half a block. By the time they reached wherever they were headed, somebody already knew, and somebody had already decided what to do about it. This is where the phrase people still use in Harlem, the ones old enough to remember hearing it from their parents, comes from. They called it Bumpy's eyes on the street, and it wasn't a figure of speech. It was closer to a literal description of how the neighborhood functioned. Every stoop had somebody on it who wasn't just sitting there. Every newsstand had a man who sold papers and also sold information, moving both without anybody buying either one noticing the difference. The mob had never encountered anything like it, because nowhere else in the city worked that way. In Little Italy, the families controlled the community through fear and through genuine cultural ties. Generations of families who'd know each other from the old country, who owed loyalty as much out of tradition as out of self-interest. In Harlem, the loyalty Johnson commanded ran on something closer to gratitude, mixed with self-preservation. He employed people. He paid them fairly by the standards of the time. He funded programs at churches, kept money moving through the community instead of only extracting it. And in exchange, when trouble came from downtown, the community didn't hesitate about which side it was on. There's a story, one of the ones that gets told and retold with small variations depending on who's telling it, about a crew that came up from Brooklyn in the early months of 1943, not sent by Costello directly, but by an underboss trying to prove he could handle the Harlem problem where others had failed. 4 men, driving a car that had clearly never been north of 96th Street before, parked near Lenox Avenue in the late afternoon, thinking they had hours of daylight to scout the area before making their move after dark. They were made within 20 minutes, not confronted, not threatened, nothing that would have tipped them off that anything was wrong, just watched. A boy selling papers walked past their car twice, close enough to read the plate, and then didn't come back a third time. A woman sweeping the sidewalk in front of a shop 2 doors down finished sweeping and went inside earlier than usual. By the time the sun started going down and those 4 men decided to move, word had already travelled uptown, across, and back down again, through channels they couldn't see and wouldn't have understood even if they'd been standing right next to the people passing it. What happened to them that night depends on who you ask, and honestly, nobody outside of Johnson's inner circle ever got the full account. What's not in dispute is that the car those men arrived in was found abandoned the next morning, several blocks from where it had been parked, and that none of the 4 men involved were ever seen doing work in Harlem again. Whether that meant they'd been persuaded, hurt, or worse, the men who sent them didn't stick around to ask questions. They took the outcome as the message it was clearly meant to be and moved on. Stories like that one did more damage to the mob's confidence than any single dramatic shootout could have, because a shootout is a single event, something that can be explained away as bad luck or a fluke, a pattern of crews going up and simply failing, quietly, without a clean story to bring back. That's something else. That's the kind of thing that makes hardened men start to hesitate, because they can't plan around something they don't understand, and professional killers, more than almost anyone, hate operating without a plan. Word started moving through the organization the way rumors always do among people who can't fully verify them, but also can't afford to dismiss them. Some of it was exaggerated, the way these things always get exaggerated once they pass through enough hands. Men who'd simply failed to find their target got remembered as men who'd vanished entirely. A minor scuffle got remembered as an ambush with a dozen shooters. But underneath the exaggeration was a real and accurate core, which was that going into Harlem after dark to do violence had become, for the families downtown, a job that nobody wanted, and that increasingly nobody was ordered to do without serious hesitation from whoever gave the order. There's a term some of the old-timers use when they talk about this period, and it isn't a term you'll find in any official history because it was never official in the first place. They call it the no-go line, and they draw it, when they're describing it with their hands, right along the 110th Street, the southern edge of Central Park, where the grid of Manhattan starts to feel like it belongs to somebody else. South of that line, in 1943, was still very much mob country, controlled the way the rest of the city was controlled, through the ordinary machinery of bribery, fear, and decades of established relationships. North of that line, especially once the sun went down, was Bumpy Johnson's, and everybody who mattered in that world knew it, whether they said it out loud or not. It's worth pausing here to think about how unusual this actually was. New York City in the middle of the 20th century did not have neighborhoods that the mob simply avoided. That wasn't how the city worked. The families had their hands in nearly every borough, every ethnic enclave, every business large enough to be worth extorting. The idea that a single black gangster in Harlem had built something durable enough to make Sicilian killers think twice, not because of a law, not because of the police, but because of the man himself and the community standing behind him, that idea alone should tell you something about who Bumpy Johnson actually was, apart from all the legend that's grown up around him since. Because make no mistake, there was a legend even then while it was happening, and Johnson understood the value of legend the way very few men in his line of work ever have. He knew that fear built on stories travels faster and lasts longer than fear built purely on force. Every time a crew went north and came back with nothing to show for it, every time a piece of information reached the commission before they'd even finished planning around it, the story got told again, in barbershops in Little Italy this time instead of Harlem, and it got a little bigger with each telling, exactly the way Johnson wanted it to. He never had to convince the whole Italian underworld that he was untouchable. He only had to make the idea plausible enough that sending men into Harlem started to feel, to the guys who actually had to go do it, like a losing hand. And once professional killers start believing a job is a losing hand, they stop volunteering for it, and the men giving the orders start running out of people willing to take the assignment without complaint. There's a particular kind of psychological pressure in that, one that doesn't show up in police reports or court records because it doesn't leave physical evidence. You can't file a report on a man who simply decided, quietly, that he'd rather take a demotion than drive uptown after dark. You can't put a number on how many planned operations against Johnson got scaled back, delayed, or quietly abandoned because the men assigned to carry them out found reasons to stall. But people who were close to that world at the time describe exactly that happening, over and over, through the spring of 1943. Not one dramatic defeat, a slow accumulation of small refusals, hesitations and failures that added up to something the Commission couldn't ignore, even if no single incident on its own would have made the newspapers. Part of what made this work was that Johnson never overplayed his hand. He didn't send men south of 110th to start trouble in Little Italy just to prove a point. He didn't go looking for a war he didn't need. His entire strategy, if you can call it that, since nobody who knew him ever described him sitting down and writing out a plan on paper, was built around making Harlem cost more to take than it was worth, and then simply waiting for the other side to do the math themselves. That's a very different kind of toughness than the version that usually gets told in stories about this era. It's not about being the loudest or the most violent man in the room. It's about controlling the terms under which violence happens, so that the other side is always fighting on the ground you chose, at a time you chose, against people you've already prepared for. The Sicilian crews the Commission sent uptown were dangerous men doing dangerous work in cities and neighborhoods where the odds favored them. In Harlem, for the first time in most of their careers, the odds didn't favor them, and it took most of them a painful education to figure that out. Consider, too, what the blackout conditions actually meant for a strategy like this, because it cuts both ways in a way that's easy to overlook. Yes, darkness gave outside crews cover to move without being seen by ordinary citizens or patrol cops distracted by wartime duties. But darkness also meant that Johnson's own people, the ones who'd spent their whole lives learning those blocks, had an advantage that outsiders simply couldn't match. A man who knows a rooftop by feel, who knows which fire escape groans and which one is silent, who knows which alley looks like a dead end but actually has a gap in the fence, that man owns the dark in a way a stranger never can, no matter how skilled he is. Johnson leaned into that hard. Some of the oral histories describe him deliberately timing certain operations, certain meetings, certain movements of cash or people, to coincide with blackout drills, specifically because he knew his own men could operate in that environment better than anyone the mob could send against them. It's a small detail, easy to miss, but it says a lot about how deliberately Johnson thought about the advantages available to him and how completely he was willing to use every one of them. There's also the matter of the rooftops themselves, which deserve more attention than they usually get in the way this story is told. Modern audiences hear the word sniper and picture something out of a war movie, a man lying flat with a scope, waiting for a single perfect shot. That's not quite what was happening above Harlem in 1943, though the effect on morale wasn't so different. What Johnson had, according to the people who described this era in the most detail, was a network of lookouts positioned high enough to see approaching cars and pedestrians from angles nobody at street level would think to check, some of them armed, most of them simply there to watch and report. The threat wasn't that every rooftop held a marksman ready to fire. The threat was that you couldn't know which ones did, and once you've heard enough stories about men who got picked off from above, without ever seeing where the shot came from, your imagination does the rest of the work for you. Fear built that way, on uncertainty rather than certainty, tends to be more effective than fear built on a known and quantifiable danger. A man can steel himself against a known risk. He can convince himself that the odds are in his favor if he's careful. It's much harder to steel yourself against a threat you can't locate, can't count, and can't predict. That's the exact position the mob's soldiers found themselves in every time they crossed north, and it wore on them in ways that pure force never could have. By the middle of 1943, the pattern had become impossible for the Commission to ignore, even setting aside pride and reputation for a moment, and just looking at the plain economics of the thing. Every failed operation costs money. Every man lost, whether to violence or simply to a career-ending reluctance to keep working the Harlem assignment, cost the organization the capability it needed for its actual, more profitable operations elsewhere in the city. And meanwhile, Johnson's own operation, battered as it was by the police harassment campaign that Costello had shifted toward once direct violence stopped paying off, kept finding ways to survive, adapt, and in some cases quietly expand, because the community around him kept absorbing the shocks and kept choosing his side. There's something worth sitting with in that last point, because it's easy in stories like this to focus entirely on the tactics, the ambushes, the information networks, and lose sight of the thing underneath all of it that actually made those tactics possible. None of the rest of it, the rooftop lookouts, the loyal bartenders, the corrupt cops who reported to Johnson instead of Costello, none of it works without a community that has already decided, for its own reasons, that it trusts one side over the other. You cannot buy that kind of loyalty overnight, and you cannot fake it under pressure. It has to be built slowly, over years, through the ordinary work of showing up for people, of putting money back into the neighborhood instead of only taking it out, of being present in ways that a stranger from downtown, however well armed, never could be. That's the part of the story that the Sicilian crews never understood, and it's arguably the reason they kept losing even when, on paper, they had every advantage. They had more men, more money, more institutional power behind them than Johnson could ever match directly. What they didn't have, and what no amount of money or muscle could buy them, was the thing Johnson had spent a decade building before the war ever forced the question, a neighborhood that would rather absorb the risk of standing with him than the risk of letting outsiders take over. It's worth thinking, too, about what this meant for the ordinary people living through it, the ones who weren't runners or lookouts or lieutenants, who just happened to live on those blocks and go about their lives while all of this was unfolding around them. For most of Harlem's residents, the war between Johnson and the Commission was something felt more than seen, a tension in the air on certain nights, a story passed along second-hand about a car that didn't belong parked somewhere it shouldn't have been, a general understanding that certain streets, certain hours, carried a weight that other streets and hours didn't. Most people never saw violence directly. What they experienced instead was something closer to living inside a story that was constantly being told and retold around them, one where the outcome always seemed to favor their side, which mattered enormously for how the neighborhood felt about itself during a period when it had very few other reasons to feel powerful in the eyes of the wider city. That's not a small thing. In a city and a country where black communities were, in almost every other respect, treated as powerless against the institutions arrayed against them, the story of a black man who'd built something the Italian mob itself was afraid to challenge directly carried a weight far beyond the actual criminal enterprise at its center. People who never placed a single bet with Johnson's operation still felt something when they heard these stories, some mixture of pride and validation that had very little to do with gambling and everything to do with what it meant to see their neighborhood hold its ground against people who assumed, wrongly, that it would simply fold the way so much else had been made to fold. It's important to say plainly that none of this makes Johnson a hero in any simple sense. He ran an illegal gambling operation that took money from people who often couldn't afford to lose it, and he did it using the same tools of violence and intimidation that every organized crime figure of that era used, just aimed in a different direction and wrapped in a different set of loyalties. The people who lived through this period and remember it fondly aren't remembering a saint. They're remembering a man who, whatever else he was, refused to let outsiders walk in and take something that belonged to the neighborhood, and who backed that refusal with enough intelligence and nerve to actually make it stick. That refusal is what turned 110th Street, an ordinary boundary on an ordinary map, into something closer to a line that professional killers wouldn't cross without a very good reason and a great deal of reluctance. It wasn't magic. It wasn't superstition, though plenty of superstition grew up around it over time, the way superstition always grows up around things people don't fully understand. It was the result of years of careful, patient work, building relationships, building information networks, building a reputation for making outside interference expensive in ways that went beyond simple violence. By the time the worst of the direct conflict cooled down, later in 1943, into an uneasy standoff that neither side wanted to formally acknowledge, the damage to the mob's confidence in its ability to simply absorb Harlem the way it had absorbed everything else had already been done. Crews that had once been sent north with total confidence now went, when they went at all, with a caution that bordered on reluctance. And the men who ran those crews, the same men who could order violence in almost any other part of the city without a second thought, learned to think twice, and then a third time, before signing off on anything that required crossing that line after dark. It's easy, looking back from this distance, to want a cleaner ending to a story like this. A final battle, a clear winner, a moment where the mob formally conceded and Johnson stood triumphant. Real history rarely works that cleanly, and this story is no exception. What actually happened was quieter and, in its way, more impressive. The commission simply stopped trying, not all at once, not with any formal announcement, but gradually, as the cost of the attempt kept outweighing whatever benefit taking Harlem might have brought. Johnson didn't need a dramatic victory. He needed the other side to run out of will, and that's exactly what happened. What's left of that period now is mostly memory, oral history passed down through families who lived it, fragments in old police files that never captured the full picture because so much of what happened never touched the official record at all. But the shape of it survives, clear enough, in the way people who know this history still talk about those blocks, still point to 110th Street as a line that meant something once, still tell the story of the crews that went up and didn't come back the way they expected to, and the community that made sure of it. One rooftop, one corner store, one quiet word passed at the right moment, at a time. That's the real story behind why the world's most feared killers wouldn't set foot in Harlem after dark. Not because of a single dramatic showdown, though there were moments dramatic enough to earn their place in the retelling. Because of a system built patiently over years by a man who understood that the deepest kind of power isn't the power to win a single fight, it's the power to make your enemy afraid to start one in the first place.